Okay, so welcome to the second lecture in our series, Jewish Responses to Persecution. I am Gail Adler, representing the Adult Education Committee at the Emmanuel Synagogue. And I'm pleased that we're hosting this program and co-sponsoring it with Congregation Beth Israel. You have housekeeping items first. As you know, we're recording the program, so we'd like to have all microphones turned off during the program, cut down on background noise. And we ask that you put your questions in the chat function on your screen. And I don't know how it's going to show up, but hopefully it'll show up to send them all to Alan Berkowitz. And if it doesn't show up that way, if you could put them into his direction, that would be great because he'll do the moderating of the questions at the end. Let's see. Oh, we're fortunate to have Alan. Yes, he's a Jewish Holocaust educator, and he's going to moderate the question and answer period after the lecture. And a special thank you to him for producing this program and for bringing it to the Emmanuel Synagogue. And I'm now going to hand over the program to Alan to do the introductions of our special speaker tonight.
Thank you so much, Gail. Once again, welcome to part 2 of our series on Jewish responses to persecution. After tonight's program, we're going to have the time for questions and answers. So again, please put them into the chat and we'll get to as many as possible. When it comes to genocide and mass atrocities, we take the words "never again" very seriously. We hope, and many of us pray, that these catastrophic events are a product of a bygone era. Yet, time and time again, we're confronted with the harsh reality that genocide and mass murder continues to be a part of the human condition. In the wake of the Holocaust, who would have believed that millions would become targets for annihilation in Cambodia, Bangladesh, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur? And that's just to name a few. The crisis continues for the Yazidi, Rohingya, and Uyghur people. Such acts raise so many questions. Tonight, we'll be focusing on what's being done to prevent these human tragedies from happening in the first place. So what does the hard work of genocide prevention look like? Do decision makers have access to this information? And as ordinary citizens, what is it that we can do? Tonight, we're so pleased to have Molly Zapata with us. Molly is the research manager for the Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. The center is part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Molly's responsible for conducting quantitative and qualitative research on atrocity prevention, with a primary focus on the center's early warning project. Molly leads the center's work on West Africa, Indonesia, and China. She holds an MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a BA from Boston University. Please join me in giving Molly a warm virtual welcome. Molly Zapata.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks all for joining this evening, and to Alan for having this idea to put together this event, and Gail for all of her help. It's great to be here virtually at the very least. I do have a presentation I'm going to share. And as was said, please feel free to submit your questions as I go. And then we'll have some time set aside for Q&A towards the end. So let me just get my screen share set up. Okay, so hopefully you all can see that. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to introduce the Simon Skjodt Center and tell you a little bit about our work overall. I'm going to talk specifically about our work on early warning through the Early Warning Project. As Alan said, that's the main portion of my job, but also kind of a key part of atrocity prevention. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of our work, and then conclude with just some ideas of what you all can do to get more involved. So why does a museum about the Holocaust work on preventing and responding to genocide today? The Committee on Conscience, whose work is carried out by the Simon Skjodt Center, was created upon the museum's founding in a reflection of this idea that a memorial unresponsive to the future would also violate the memory of the past. So we really see the museum as a living memorial. Our work is intended to honor those who died during the Holocaust by preventing such crimes from reoccurring. So the Simon Skjodt Center carries out the mission of the Committee on Conscience, and our mandate is to alert the national conscience and stimulate worldwide action to confront and work to halt acts of genocide or related crimes against humanity. I'll note here that the museum is an independent government institution, and the Simon Skjodt Center is part of the museum, but we do not receive any federal funding. We are fully donor funded, which enables us to maintain a degree of independence. So to fulfill that mandate, which is quite broad and ambitious, we do this in a number of ways. So we sound the alarm at the early warning signs of potential violence by identifying ways governments and institutions can respond, and we call for action before atrocities begin. In terms of response, in those cases, as Alan mentioned, where genocide or mass atrocities may be ongoing, we help leaders identify effective prevention, developing policies, practices, and tools that can be used to end the atrocities that are occurring. We also have what we call our Forensic International Justice Initiative. Their work helps victims and survivor communities hold perpetrators accountable for their crimes after atrocities have occurred. And then we do a lot in terms of public engagement. So we do education via our website, exhibits in the museum when it is open, which will hopefully be soon, public events through social media, things along those lines. And most importantly, in all circumstances, we stand with victims and survivors to amplify their voices and their priorities. Really what we like to say is that what we do today for communities, what was not done for the Jews of Europe in the 1930s and 40s. So just a quick note on definitions, as I've already said a few of these terms. Of course, genocide is in the name of our center, but we work on a little bit broader of a scope of crimes, so genocide and related crimes against humanity. And all of these crimes collectively are known a little bit more colloquially as mass atrocities or atrocity crimes. So we consider mass atrocities to be large-scale systematic violence against civilian populations. So to prevent something, you need a reliable system for predicting where risk is most acute, where to direct your resources. So to that end, we created the Early Warning Project in 2014 with two main goals in mind. So one was to improve the quality and depth of discussions about risk for mass atrocities and genocide, and then also to advance the science of early warning. We talk about this as a first of its kind early warning system. So it is the first publicly available early warning system for these crimes. These types of analyses exist within governments. They are often classified, but we do everything completely publicly so that people like you, people who are in the countries at risk, civil society organizations, et cetera, can access this information. We are also fully transparent. So everything I'm talking about today and quite a bit more is available on our website. And part of the reasoning behind that is to advance the science, we put out our analyses so other people can build on it and work with it more. And then finally, this is a multi-method approach to forecasting risk for mass atrocities. So the methods we use are broadly in these three kind of categories. So the first is our annual statistical risk assessment, which uses quantitative analysis to basically sort the world into categories of risk and identify countries maybe that are increasing and decreasing in risk over time. We use that statistical risk assessment to select countries for in-depth country-specific analyses to better understand what's going on in a country at risk and what policymakers should do to prevent those crimes from occurring. And then we've also been experimenting with different crowd forecasting or survey mechanisms. So going back to advancing the science of early warning to better understand real-time risk. So if you think about this as kind of a comprehensive project, that statistical model tells you broadly where to look. The crowd forecasting might tell you in a more short-term, this is where should you be paying attention. Those kind of reports really give you the in-depth of this is what you need to do about it in terms of prevention. So our emphasis is on analysis that can inform efforts to prevent mass atrocities and genocide, not just respond after the fact. And all of our information is available on our website. I can drop a link to this in the chat later on. But we conduct these annual statistical risk assessments to help governments, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations determine where to devote resources for additional analysis, policy attention, and ultimately, of course, preventive action. So I won't go too in depth on this, but happy to go back if you all have questions. So to produce our risk assessment, we compile data on risk factors going back to 1945. And then we put all of this data into a machine learning model that effectively asks the question, what countries today look like countries that have experienced mass killing in the past in the 1 to 2 years before that mass killing began? And the result of that is a risk assessment that ranks all countries in the world based on their risk for experiencing new mass atrocities. Whoops, there we go. So this full list is on our website, but just wanted to give you a quick snapshot. I'll talk about a little bit about a few of these countries. But first, it's important to understand that the purpose of our model is to forecast risk for new mass killing. So a lot of times people might see these results and say, well, Syria is not ranked #1, Burma is not ranked #1. You know, what's going on here? There's countries with ongoing atrocity crimes and genocide in some cases. So those cases, because they have ongoing mass atrocities, are not as high risk because we're forecasting the risk that a new mass killing begins, that a new genocide begins. The idea here is to try to get out ahead of these things before we're already doing response. And that's not to say that those countries don't merit attention. The Simon Scott Center has a huge body of work focusing on ending atrocities around the world. Our current focus countries for those lines of effort are Iraq, Syria, Burma, South Sudan, and China. But the early warning project model is designed, again, to identify countries at risk where we can still prevent things from beginning or getting worse. So just a couple examples to kind of talk you through how we think about these statistical results. So because we produce this risk assessment annually, we can track changes over time. So the case of Colombia, it's ranked 15th this year. We consider the top 30 countries to be high risk. But last year, Colombia ranked 50th, or sorry, it ranked 65th. It jumped up 50 spots from one year to another. So that suggests to us that there's something going on there that we should be looking into. So we are currently doing additional research on Colombia to better understand who is at risk for mass atrocities, what might be influencing those conflict dynamics. And this could be a case where the project really serves an early warning function, since Colombia has experienced mass atrocities in the past, but is not currently experiencing that scale of violence. Another country example to talk about is China. So China ranked 28th in this year's risk assessment. Like I said, top 30 are high risk, but I think considering ongoing atrocities in China, people are a little bit surprised that it's not higher in that assessment. The US government has determined that genocide and crimes against humanity are ongoing against the Uyghur community in Xinjiang in Western China. And so this is an interesting case in that it's a country where mass atrocities are occurring. Like I said, the State Department determined genocide and crimes against humanity, but mass killing is not occurring. So it's a very different case than other atrocity crimes we've seen in the past. So taking a step back and just talking about kind of what we do with this and how we measure impact. So when we publish these risk assessments, whenever we publish as CPG any reports on countries, we do a lot of outreach, primarily to policymakers, but also to educational institutions, to the general public, to make sure that people understand where we see the risks present and what we think they should do about it. We really see the risk assessment as a starting point for additional analysis, and we hope that at the very least, it gives people another lens through which to see a country that they're thinking about, and to draw attention to the need for atrocity prevention. So a few examples: the Early Warning Project is one of only a few sources named in the Global Fragility Act and Elie Wiesel Act, so two pieces of legislation passed in a few years. And so the Early Warning Project is identified as a source for the US government to determine which countries are at risk, since they're required by those laws to prioritize countries at risk, and also what State Department personnel require training. So part of that in the Elie Wiesel Act is that countries at risk means that people who are working in the embassies in those countries, who are working in USAID, things along those lines, need a specific atrocity prevention training. And so our list is contributing to that. Another example, just to kind of talk through a case of how we use this risk assessment and what kind of impacts we've seen. So we selected Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa as an in-depth case study on early warning back in 2018. So we saw that it had ranked consistently high in the statistical risk assessment and was increasing in risk. So we conducted field research there in partnership with a local expert in 2018. And we published a report in 2019 focused on the elections that were in October 2020. So we really started this work 2 years before the potential triggering event of violence, and then published a little over a year before that happened, the idea of we needed to give people enough time, not just to say, hey, here's a warning, something bad's gonna happen next week, but to say something bad might happen in a year and a half. Start funding programs that are needed to prevent those crimes from happening. So our report on Cote d'Ivoire was the most cited report about the 2020 elections, and it was used by the US government, the Ivorian government, the EU and the UN to direct atrocity prevention resources. So a few specific impacts within the US government that we saw. USAID increased its countering dangerous speech programming in the country as a result of our report. US intelligence agencies sent additional analysts to Cote d'Ivoire to better understand the risk for violence against civilians. And this past fall, the House Foreign Affairs Committee passed a resolution calling for a peaceful electoral process in Cote d'Ivoire. And that kind of thing, might seem symbolic, but it is front page news in the country, or it was. And it really sent the signal that people are watching, people are paying attention, to governments and to non-state actors who might commit acts of violence, basically saying, like, if you do, you probably won't get away with it. Like, we're paying attention here. And then finally, I wanted to just talk about what you all can do. I mean, first of all, you're doing one piece of it, which is spending an evening learning about atrocity prevention with me. So I really appreciate that you've taken this time and are interested. We encourage people to stay informed about atrocity prevention, follow the news, visit our website to learn more about ongoing genocides and atrocities. If there are countries that you find, more interesting than others or have some connection to, do a little bit of research. We provide country pages for every country on the Early Warning Project website, and a few more in-depth ones on the Center for Prevention of Genocide website. But there are a lot of resources out there to learn a little bit more. We encourage people to support education and relief efforts. So if there is a particular case or a particular theme you're interested in, you can find out more about humanitarian organizations, what they're doing in response to mass atrocities, and how you may be able to help. We encourage you all to join the museum community if you're not already a part. So you can sign up to receive email updates on our website. You can also follow us on Twitter and on our Facebook page. I'll put those links in the chat if those are of interest. And then we encourage you to engage with your community. So not just education for yourself, but talk about it with your friends, your family. These are the things you've learned. This is what you've seen. We suggest also contacting the media. So the media responds to what the demand is. Tell television, radio, local newspapers, online journalists that you want to see better coverage of risks of genocide or cases where genocides are occurring and you aren't seeing enough news. Write to your local paper. Why aren't I seeing information about this event? And then finally, we encourage you to call your elected representatives. Tell them what countries and topics are important to you. So I mentioned that we do a lot of outreach to policymakers. So, in normal times I go in person. At this point, I go via Zoom to Capitol Hill and I meet with senators and representatives from all over the country. And it's always really interesting to me which ones care about atrocity prevention, because it can feel very random. It's someone who says, oh, I have a lot of Cameroonians in my district, so I care a lot about Cameroon, as like random representative from Texas. Like I wouldn't have expected that. or someone saying, hey, I've gotten a lot of phone calls about what's going on in China. Can you come up and talk about it with us so we can understand what we should be doing here? So I don't know how much people realize calling your representative can make a difference, especially for topics such as this that are important, but especially in terms of early warning and prevention can fall by the wayside because the tendency is to address things that are, in crisis, completely on fire right now. But where there are cases of early warning, a lot of difference can be made by not even that much effort or resources, just a little bit additional attention. And that's the end of my presentation. Sorry, Alan, that was shorter than I even thought, but I hope that covered some interesting points and gave us a lot of time for questions.
I think it raises a tremendous amount of points that I think that I would like to discuss. You can stop sharing if you like.
Yes.
And the first question, please feel free to put questions in there. The first question that we have relates to kind of like the origin of, even before 2014 in the United States, what did genocide awareness and genocide prevention look like? The United States was a late signatory to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. You may want to address that a little bit. And this question has to deal with the blueprint for addressing genocide by our government that was established by William Cohen and Madeleine Albright. And so these are two things that were kind of the forebearers, so to speak. And how did that impact some of the work that you do?
It's a good question. There's a lot. So I'm just thinking through, when we think about genocide, we can think of ongoing cases. People obviously think of the Holocaust, but then the big ones, right, that are after the Holocaust don't really come up until Bosnia and Rwanda in the early 90s. And so if we start there, which there were atrocities before that, of course, but I think that there was a move and increasing recognition over time within policy spaces that, we really can't let these things happen again. I mean, people said never again a lot after the Holocaust. They said it kind of redoubled after Rwanda. And then kind of the slow build of atrocity prevention policy. So when you think about the genocide in Darfur, that was a big deal. That became a huge grassroots movement that eventually resulted in a genocide determination in, I forget what year, around 2004, it was the early 2000s. And so kind of, I feel like coming out of that momentum, there was an increasing recognition within the US policy spaces that, we shouldn't just be preventing conflict and violence, but there is a specific type of violence, intentional targeting of civilians that should be intentionally prevented as its own specific unique thing. So the Albright-Cohen report was a big part of that. The museum supported it. And one of the key findings of that, actually a different version of this presentation, I include a quote from it, because one of their key findings was if you cannot predict something, you can't effectively prevent it. And so then that also was part of the Obama administration era when there was the Presidential Study Directive 10 that recognized atrocity prevention as a US national security priority and created the Atrocities Prevention Board. So that was an interagency board. So if you think about all the US government agencies have all of their heads, and they came together to identify countries at risk for mass atrocities and direct what we call a whole of government response. So it's not just USAID responding to atrocities in a place. It's not just the State Department. Kind of all these departments are supposed to come together and come up with a comprehensive strategy when a country is at risk. The Atrocities Prevention Board, we've got off the ground in around 2010. And continued to exist through the Trump administration. It was renamed the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force. And that's something that as we go into a new administration now, I think, a lot of things are being rearranged in Washington at the moment, but we're in close contact with colleagues in the State Department who are trying to figure out what atrocity prevention looks like within the US government in the coming years, because we have a general expectation that it will be more of a priority than it has been recently. But we're not sure exactly what that's going to look like. So yeah, I think the US sees atrocity prevention as important. I think what I've seen is that it's a very bipartisan issue, which is great. There's not a lot of controversy around it, or mixed controversy, but in general, people can agree that genocide is a bad thing. And whether people talk about it as human rights or they talk about it as religious freedom, there's kind of a number of ways that people come to this issue. And I think that that's really useful from a government response perspective because it's not as politicized as kind of other issues within the government might be. The question of exactly how you respond to things can become very tricky. But yeah, I think that we're seeing, we didn't see atrocity prevention go away, and I think we can expect to see it become increasingly important, especially with issues like the Uyghurs in China becoming, front page news over the past couple of years and getting a lot of attention.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Darfur because that goes to our next question as it relates to environmental issues. And even when you're talking about West Africa, it's hard to believe that water is an issue. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. And so I know it's a lot, but take as long as you wish to address it. But so the first part of it is environmental issues. And when we're talking about Darfur, I should say, this is a genocide that was looked at as some kind of ethno-religious conflict when it was nothing of the sort. So, it had elements of that, but basically we're looking at a economic and environmental crisis in part. And, and as nations are building dams and how do, and restricting water in parts of the world. And as much as we'd like to believe that climate change is not a major factor, the reality is that it is, and is contributing so much to the number of people that are in crisis. So the question would go to the combining of the question would be, is the economic, first of all, would be the environmental issues dealing with water, whether it be Darfur or West Africa. And that includes how that helps in the assessment in terms of the availability of arable land. And then when these crises happen, we'll get into the second part of the question, but I'd like to leave that with you because how does the environment that we live in impact your assessment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a lot of pieces to it. So I think one thing that people want to do naturally, but we can't really do, is say that any one cause is the cause of a complex crisis like genocide or mass atrocity. So in the case of Darfur, there are environmental factors. Sure, there's religious factors, there's interethnic factors, there are economic factors, and they're all important. And I think that the tendency is to say, oh, it's a religious conflict, or oh, it's an ethnic conflict, and kind of write something off, or even to say, oh, it's just an economic conflict, right? But all of these things interact with each other in really important ways when we're trying to understand risk. So I can talk a little bit about the cases in West Africa. So before the Cote d'Ivoire research, we were working on Mali, the country, not me, where competition for resources along the Sahel, so the border basically between the Sahara Desert and more coastal West Africa. The desert is increasing due to a variety of factors: climate change, deforestation, poor farming practices that don't rejuvenate the land in the right time period. I mean, there's a lot of pieces of this. And that's a huge influence on the risk for violence because you have groups coming into contact with one another and increasingly competing over resources, whether that's water, does it go to the herders and their cows, or does it go to the farmers and their land, whether that's trees or farmland or whatever those things are. And so yeah, like the climate piece, climate change piece, and environment piece is really important to understand in that conflict. Um, but at the same time, it's a governance issue. So it's both, right? Because it's, if you say it's just climate change, like, well, what are we going to do about it? We can't stop climate change, we can't prevent it, or it's already going. So do we give up? But really, these groups have been in competition for resources for centuries. Like, these groups have always kind of existed in this area, and there's always been issues of land and water management that they have come up with systems to manage. And so what the actual, like, if we're looking to solutions to the problem, yes, address climate change. But in a more short term, it's about governance issues and access to resources and how it's being unevenly distributed. And so that's when we think about atrocity risk, which groups might have an interest or incentive to want to kill other people. Is it about, well, I feel like they have gotten unfair benefits from the government, and so now it's my turn to retake what rightfully belongs to me, and the only way to do so is through violence because the justice system doesn't work, for example. That's a super simplification. But these are the kinds of things that we think about when we're looking at atrocity risk, because you do see them coming up in a lot of circumstances. I mean, water is huge. There's a lot of research on the role of water in Syria and the Syrian conflict, in Darfur, in West Africa. And I think also the other piece of it is change. And so it's not that, like I said, like, people have been competing for resources always, but the speed at which things are changing in terms of climate, in terms of resources, is a shock to the system. And if the system isn't resilient, if there aren't governance mechanisms in place or judicial mechanisms to resolve your grievances in place, and there's a shock to a system, you often see people feeling they have no choice but to join an armed group to fight for what they see as belonging to their community. And then identity factors come in, mostly because it's the easiest way to mobilize people around your cause. And so many conflicts that we work on that are early warning conflicts, if you look at it from the outside, it's like, well, is it a religious conflict? It's like, not really. I mean, people are of different religions, but that's not why they're in conflict with one another. But if you're someone who's trying to mobilize support and get people to join your armed group, it's probably easier for you to say, look at those people over there who are different from us, and use that kind of animosity to get people on the side of your cause. And so we see kind of identity factors becoming increasingly salient when maybe the initial cause is economic competition over water access. And so these things kind of compound over time in ways that, maybe the worst case end result is genocide or mass atrocities. But even in the short term, low level violent conflict that goes on for years at a time and prevents children from going to school and prevents development in a country. So yeah, that's kind of a long answer, but just a few ways of how I think about resources and climate in our work. And I guess one thing also to say is that in that statistical model, we don't have data on climate as a part of the model or on water. And that's not because we don't think it's important, it's because those data sets don't exist. So I know you guys aren't probably, well, I don't know, maybe you are in charge of creating data sets, but one of the big problems that we and others run into is that there are so many factors that might be really important, that there just isn't reliable data covering enough countries, covering enough time periods on those factors. So that's something that I bring up often, because I hope that people are out there creating those data sets that we can then use.
So when getting back to a previous question that was asked that related to genocide prevention being in our own interest, as opposed to something that's happening somewhere to someone else, and we can turn a blind eye to it because it doesn't have any impact to us. And the U.S. had the blueprint, and Tony Blair had his so-called Blair Doctrine, and explained the economic impact that led to refugee crises, violence, disruptions to commerce, the potential spillover effects of disease. How do you guys integrate that kind of information in there? Is there is there some implication that if something happens in country X, it's most likely going to spill over to country Y?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on probably who I'm talking to and trying to convince to care. Because some people, just saying like civilians shouldn't be killed is enough to get them to mobilize. But of course, everyone has a variety of interests and kind of pressures and motivations. So yeah, we look into the economic costs of atrocities. So for the Cote d'Ivoire work, I wrote a brief looking at, so Cote d'Ivoire has a really strong economy, largely due to cocoa and cashew production, and has one of the largest ports in West Africa. So people who might not care about atrocity prevention otherwise, if you make the case that if large scale violence happens here, that port's going to shut down. That's costing, bajillions of dollars every single day to not just the Cote d'Ivoire, but to countries around the region, to Europe, to the US, because everyone's using that port. Or, we talk to cocoa companies. Most cocoa comes out of Cote d'Ivoire. And so if those supply chains are interrupted, all of a sudden they care a lot more than maybe they would have otherwise. What are some of the other things? Yeah, and then the security factors of it are huge. I mean, I can't think of any single case of mass atrocities that stay within that country's borders. So the regional dynamics are really important. And oftentimes when we're working on atrocity prevention, the countries who care the most are the neighbors, because if there are refugee flows, they're going to go next door first. And so I think that that's, an important factor to consider. And then also, of course, an important factor for, Europe, the US, as over the past however many years it's been now, that refugee issues have become increasingly kind of front page news, saying, well, what if we take a few steps to prevent this from happening so that we don't have to deal with the refugee crisis, so that people don't have to become refugees. And then also we've looked into, but haven't done yet, like a more thorough analysis on the multi-generational impacts of atrocities. Because if you think about from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, when genocide and crimes against humanity happen, they don't just affect the people they happen directly to. They happen to an entire country. They affect people for multiple generations. And so if you want to be like purely an economist about that, how many dollars of productivity are lost because people were killed or people were unable to work or things weren't able to grow as they would have otherwise. But also when you think from a psychosocial perspective, what are the impacts on not just those people, but their children and their children's children in the long run? I don't know how you measure that type of thing, but I think that's something that, especially as the Holocaust Museum, we worked, not me, but others at the museum have worked on kind of the intergenerational impacts of the Holocaust and what that trauma kind of manifests in and what that looks like for victim communities. And so that's something else to consider in the long run. So yeah, like I said, it depends on who I'm talking to and what argument, they're going to find the most compelling. But I think basically all evidence points to you can't just ignore things happening in other countries because it's not your country. Because if you say it's not my problem, it's going to become your problem eventually. And I think there's an increasing recognition of that.
Thank you. So the next question has to deal with the impact of failed states, whether they be in Africa, like Libya or Somalia, and what circumstances surround the fact that they became failed states. And I know we want to prevent them. And the question is directly related to about extremist elements in those states, whether they be religious, political, ethnic, or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. The problem of when these things do happen, how do you deal with them? How do you fix them? How do you turn back the clock? If you take a case like Syria, like Libya, like Somalia, it's really difficult. So I don't have an easy answer to this by any means, but this is actually a stream of work that we're working on the research team at the Simon Skjodt Center right now, is what we're calling lessons learned in atrocity prevention. So basically saying, as I talked about, atrocity prevention has existed to some extent for quite a few years at this point. What do we know and not know about what works and what doesn't work? Is it sanctions work in these cases, but not these other cases? Demobilizing combatants works if they're this type of combatant, but not if they're that type of combatant, but only in cases where the crimes were of this type. And so we're really contributing to the effort to better systematically understand that, so that if you are a policymaker and you're assigned to work on Libya and you say, okay, what are my options here? What do we know about what might work the best? You have a little bit more information. I think on the extremist group front of things, I mean, there's quite a bit of work on demobilization and what that looks like. And I think, it's complicated, and from the outside, easy to say, well, like, these people are extremists, like, they're crazy, they're, whatever, they're bad people. But so often when you look at recruitment, the series of choices they made sense. And that's a huge problem. Like, most people are joining extremist groups for economic reasons, or they had no other resources, or this was a group they could become a member of and feel valued in their society. And so this goes back to prevention more than response, but I think in a response place, how do you de-radicalize someone and provide those things that that group was providing, but in a way that's not destructive and harmful? And that's, a whole process that has much more resources dedicated to it than atrocity prevention does, which is good. But yeah, I think that's one that we're also still not 100% sure what works and doesn't work in all cases. So it's a long-term project.
Well, we're going to fire a couple more tough ones at you, Molly, and we
Go
really
for it.
appreciate your time this evening. Well, the next question has to do with something that is kind of antithetical to our thinking in the first place, which is often that persecution of groups is popular within countries. I don't know how you guys would make some kind of assessment in relation to that, or be able to judge that. But the question relates to the persecution is often broadly popular in a society, or at least most people are indifferent to what's happening to those in crisis. Is there some way that you measure that and put that into the equation?
So that is in some ways measured actually and included in our model. So we have, I forget the exact name of the variables, but exclusion of social groups, if all social groups have access to power or not, if all social groups have access to justice or not, things along those lines are factored in. And then I think, like, which is like kind of the implied next step of like, what do you do about that? That's where I think education really comes in. So we look at disinformation quite a bit. And so, yeah, it's like messages spreading on social media, in newspapers, on the radio, saying, all people from this ethnic group are terrorists, for example. Where does that message come from? But also, how do you prevent that message from spreading? And then how do you counter it? So my understanding of kind of studies of disinformation at this point is that you're never going to shut it down. You're not going to delete all hate speech from Facebook. It's probably not possible, or isn't possible the way the system currently works. But the better option is to put out counter messaging. And so what we see in cases where, like that example of all people of a certain ethnic group are terrorists, you put up programming on the radio that may be entertaining, but it shows people from these different groups intermarried and they're just talking, or it's a dialogue between communities, women's groups getting together and saying, hey, we can't have conflict here, like, we're going to bring everyone together and talk it through. Those are the types of things that I've seen in other countries to prevent that, not necessarily prevent the dangerous speech from spreading, but to prevent the effects of it and kind of counterbalance it with other pieces. There's also, a lot of terrible things being out there said in the world, which should be addressed, but it's not necessarily always a atrocity risk factor. And that's where this statistical model comes in handy, because if you're seeing hate speech in, like, I don't know, a country that's really low risk, Ireland, that's bad, but it's probably not going to influence atrocities. It's probably not going to cause a genocide there because the country is low risk for a variety of other factors. But if you're seeing that same type of speech, but it's happening in, say, Somalia or South Sudan or China, so many places, then that tells you, hey, this is actually like a problem from an atrocity prevention perspective that we should be addressing.
The next question has to deal with something that you brought up earlier about statistical risks, crowd forecasting, and country reports. And could you talk a little bit more about how decision makers get information from you? And is there information sharing that comes from the government, not from you, but to you, in terms of some of their assessments? So is it a two-way relationship?
Kind of, but so I can receive government information that like the general public can receive. I don't have a security clearance. I can't see anything that's classified. So it is limiting what they can share with me oftentimes, or they'll share with me a version of something, or they're thinking on something without necessarily giving us the information. So like the data sources in our model are not, special information that we got from the US government. They're only the publicly available things. But when it comes to kind of how we share information with them, it's through, honestly, like phone calls like this. I present our research a lot. And depending on the audience, it's a really in-depth focus on one specific country, or really focused on the data, or focused on certain trends or dynamics that they're interested in. But we're in pretty regular contact. We have a whole policy team with people on the Hill, at the State Department, and at USAID. So we have a main point of contact that then kind of everything comes filtered through. So if they're saying, hey, we're getting a lot of questions about Mozambique, have you guys looked into it at all? That might be something that I'm researching, but nothing's published yet, or something that we can give more specific recommendations in a private meeting than we would necessarily publish more broadly. So I think that's where kind of our special relationship as the Holocaust Museum, as that kind of quasi-government feeling, comes in handy, and also because we're really focused on education and not advocacy, which advocacy should definitely exist, but like we're kind of from the perspective of, we will help you understand everything you need to know about atrocity risk in this case. And so I think more the information that we would be getting from the US government is just to better understand their priorities and what they're looking to, because then we can better educate them on what they need to be thinking about in terms of atrocity prevention in all those cases. But yeah, so it's mostly through presentations, meetings, and kind of a regular back and forth phone calls. And we are, like I said, not the government, but if there's a question about genocide, we're kind of the go-to source. So that is helpful for both us and them.
So with that in mind, it's kind of another two-part program, fusing a couple of questions here. One had to deal with when Colin Powell was Secretary of State around, I believe it was Rwanda. They asked him, why didn't the government respond? And he said, the phones didn't ring. And can it be that simple of what motivates our decision makers to act? And the second part of the question would be, what would you like to see in terms of genocide education and awareness in our public schools and private schools?
Yeah, so the phones didn't ring thing. Yeah, to some extent. I think that was, not that long ago, but long enough ago that people didn't have the same amount of information kind of coming from all over the world 24/7 that we have at this point, which enables, more kind of general public type of people to be aware of things that are going on at the same time. But yeah, I think, in general, policymakers are responding to a lot at any given time, and they do care what people think. Like I said, if you call your representatives, they care and keep track. It's probably an intern you're going to talk to, but they're going to note down who you were and what you wanted to hear about. And if they get enough people calling about that thing, then that senator or representative will come to me and say, hey, I keep getting questions on this thing. What should I be saying? What should I be doing? What do I need to be thinking about? I think, the counter to the Rwanda case is the Darfur case, where the whole huge activist Save Darfur movement built so much momentum and kind of grassroots attention within the US in a really unprecedented way that got so many people within the US and the US government to prioritize atrocity prevention in Sudan, which, probably 10 years before that, no one had ever heard of. So I think there is a lot that can be done from a grassroots level to influence the government, even though it feels kind of like this massive, impossible bureaucratic monster. At the end of the day, policymakers are people. And if you make a compelling case to them, or if enough people make compelling cases to them, they're going to respond to that. I think in terms of genocide education, it's a good question and not one that I've gotten before. I think mostly, well, so many pieces. I'm like geography, just like understanding different parts of the world. That Africa is not a country. It's a lot of different countries and they're all different. But on the a little bit more complicated piece of it is to make sure that when you're teaching about genocide, about mass atrocities, it's not just the Holocaust happened, Rwanda happened, and some conflicts are ethnic and some conflicts are religious. I think it's getting into the nuance of, like we're talking about, other causes, other things that influence it, because the tendency is to oversimplify. It makes it easier for us to understand something. But when the answer is, oh, those people just hate each other, it's not constructive for anyone and it's not educational. So I think it's improved. I mean, genocide education is still kind of a niche, but improved over time of not just educating people about the Holocaust, but the museum does a lot to educate people about the early warning signs that led to the Holocaust. So, once we can go places again, if you all haven't been to the Holocaust Museum, there's a whole floor that you can go on an early warning tour of and talk through kind of the lead up to the Holocaust, and what the role of the police was, what the role of the military was, what politicians were doing and saying, and identify kind of those risk factors. And we do this with groups who come in and give them that tour and then talk about, countries today and what the parallels that we see are. Because I think it's too easy to say, oh, bad things happen sometimes, but it takes a little bit more effort and a little bit more teaching. And this is where the education piece comes in, to understand that none of these things are inevitable. There are always early warning signs. You just have to pay attention to recognize the warning signs.
Thank you. One final question. And so in line with everything else, we'll fuse two so more people get their questions in. The first part of the question is that you spoke about the Ben Ferencz International Justice Center. Does the Simon Scott Center provide data or testimony for prosecution of atrocities as it relates to restorative and or if it relates to restorative justice? And has the assessment of the United States changed over the last 4 years in terms of potential violence?
On the first piece,
it's not a political question.
So on the first one, I don't know that we've ever provided information to the International Criminal Court directly. And that's not really our expertise, what we do, as far as, it takes a very specific set of skills to go interview victims of atrocities and to document those responsibly. So I don't know that we have, but the role of the Ferencz Initiative is somewhat unique, or kind of a new movement in justice. Is not just us coming in as Americans and saying, well, this is what you have to document and this is how you achieve justice and this is what justice is, but it's working with communities who have been victims of violence, connecting them with legal experts, but helping them work through and kind of facilitating a discussion of, what does justice look like to you? What does that mean? How do you achieve that? What are the options? Because it's not that the International Criminal Court is the only way to achieve justice. And that might not be the most meaningful way to achieve justice in all cases or to all people. And so yeah, that piece of it is more bringing together the communities themselves and determining, okay, this is what we want. This is what we want to achieve. These are the court mechanisms, whether they're national or regional or international, to achieve those outcomes. But also maybe that's looking more like intercommunal dialogues or truth-telling things along those lines. So there's a lot out there that can be justice, and it's not just a court case. So we're more focused on kind of helping people work through that process to achieve those outcomes. And then the question on the US, are you asking about like risk in the US? So the US is generally low risk for mass atrocities, which is good. So yeah, I mean, the institutional strength in the US kind of counterbalances a lot of other factors. And so when you think about it, you know, in terms of the statistical risk assessment, we've had a stable transition of power for many, many years. We have really strong institutions. We have independent institutions. You know, we have many problems, but generally we're pretty good on human rights, and, you know, no groups are specifically excluded from, you know, political power or economic power, things along those lines. But I mean, it has come up over the past, you know, year or so in particular, some of these kind of risk factors that when you're doing that additional qualitative analysis are popping up in the US more than people might hope. So I think that's worth attention, and it's worth kind of taking these tools that we have to look in other places and look inward. I feel like that's a worthwhile exercise regardless. But yeah, in general, I would say the US is low, but at the same time, everything that you would understand and learn towards atrocity prevention would probably be a thing worth doing anyways. So it absolutely can't hurt to be paying more acute attention. And I think that's something, yeah, over the past, you know, couple months in particular, there's been a lot of discussion of people saying, oh, I never thought this could happen here. I never thought this would happen in America. You know, we're not special. Everyone has problems, and no one ever thinks that something bad is going to happen in their country ever until it does. And so yeah, I think, you know, people are applying the atrocity risk tools to the US to some extent, but it's not something that we're particularly concerned about at the moment.
Molly, we can't thank you enough for being with us here tonight. And we know how busy you are, and to be able to put this program together, we're so pleased that you were able to join us. And a big part of what we were trying to do tonight was to add to the knowledge of genocide, what our roles are, what we can do, and to raise awareness, and also to empower us that everybody, whether they be an individual, an organization, has a role to play. So thank you once again. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tammy to close out the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everyone. My name is Tammy Kraushar, and I'm the chair of Emmanuel Synagogue's Adult Education Committee. We're so pleased to have everyone with us this evening and look forward to a time when we can share these programs together in person. We're committed to bringing important, informative, and innovative programming to our local synagogues and to the community at large. I'd like to thank the adult education committees of both Emmanuel Synagogue and Congregation Israel support, without which this program would not have been possible. We also want to thank Voices of Hope and the Jewish Historical Society for making this program available to their patrons. Last but not least, I want to thank Gail Adler, Alan Berkowitz, and our lovely presenter, Molly Zapata, for helping us bring this program to life and giving us a wonderful evening. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again at another one of our programs.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for coming, guys. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Great program, Molly. Thank you.
Thanks. Hope that was okay.
I think we made her work. We made her work tonight.
There's never an easy Q&A session, I'm not gonna lie. But no, those were good questions, and hopefully it was interesting.
You never know.
Saying a quick hello and goodbye.
That's Lois.
Some of you look familiar to me, yes. So.
Lois doing a flyby.
Thanks.
So we would like to send a stipend. Can we send it directly to you?
Oh, no, I can't take any money.
Can we send a stipend to the center in your honor?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, and we will do that.
Address it goes to or attention.
That's really too bad, Molly, because You would have been able to buy a new car.
No.
Bummer, man.
Alan, you can do that.
Yeah,
Yes.
thanks so much. And we will do that. And where would you like us to send it to? Just send it to Simon Scott Center. Anyone's
Yeah,
okay.
I can send you, I don't know, I think it's pretty easy, but I can send you the link too if that's easier.
Yeah, we will.
Um,
Yeah, that's
But
fine.
yeah, that'd be great. And yeah, if you hear any like feedback after the fact, if there's anything noteworthy or people had additional questions, I'd love to hear it. So feel free to follow up.
Sure. Gail, are you still recording?
Oh, yes, I am.
Jeez. We talked about this last time.
So wrapped up in stuff, you forget.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. I would have let it go on forever. Yes, I can do
So
It's still recording.
Recording.